The coastal town of Merlo Bay hadn't changed much in 18 years. Same weathered boardwalk stretching along the shore. Same faded blue awnings over storefronts that had been there since Julian Blackwood was a child. Even the salt-tinged air carried the same mixture of seaweed and fried food from Donovan's Pier. Julian adjusted his Italian sunglasses as he stepped out of the black Tesla, keys dangling from manicured fingers. At 36, he moved with the confident precision of a man who'd grown accustomed to the world bending to his will. His charcoal suit, handcrafted in Milan, seemed almost comically out of place among the sun-faded t-shirts and worn jeans of passers-by. "Mr. Blackwood, your reservation at the Harbor Inn is confirmed," his assistant's voice chimed through his earpiece. "The mayor will meet you tomorrow at 9. Would you like me to arrange dinner that's all for now?" "Teresa?" Julian interrupted, his attention caught by something across the street. "I'll check in later." He ended the call and stared at the storefront with its hand-painted sign, Tidewater Books and Tea. The old fisherman's market was gone, replaced by large windows displaying colorful book spines and comfortable reading nooks. Through the glass, he could see customers browsing shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Julian hadn't planned on stopping. His schedule was meticulously arranged. This trip was purely business. A quick meeting with local officials, property assessments, then back to Seattle. Nothing more. Yet his feet carried him across the street. A bell chimed softly as he entered. The scent of old books mingled with fresh coffee and something else, lavender, perhaps. The shop was larger than it appeared from outside, with reading alcoves tucked into corners and a small café area toward the back. "Be right with you," called a woman's voice from behind a stack of newly arrived books. Julian wandered the aisles, fingers brushing spines of books. A memory surfaced, sitting cross-legged on worn carpet, flashlight illuminating pages long after bedtime. Before smartphones. Before billions. Before everything changed. "Can I help you find something?" The woman who approached wore a simple blue dress, chestnut hair pulled back in a loose braid. She carried an armful of children's books, head tilted slightly as she assessed him. There was something familiar in her sea-green eyes, the slight curve of her smile. "Just browsing," Julian replied automatically. She nodded, continuing past him to a nearby shelf. "Well, feel free to look around. Coffee's fresh if you'd like some. Though you strike me as more of an espresso person." Julian raised an eyebrow. "And how would you know that?" The woman turned, studying him more carefully now. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then widened with recognition. The books in her arms tumbled to the floor. "Jules?" she whispered, using a nickname no one had uttered in nearly 2 decades. "Jules Blackwood?" Something cold and electric shot through him. Only one person had ever called him that. "Ellie?" The childhood name slipped out before he could stop it. "It's Elise now," she said softly. "Elise Winters." She shook her head in disbelief. "My God, didn't you look so different?" Julian swallowed against an unexpected tightness in his throat. "So do you." They stood frozen in mutual shock until another customer approached with a question, breaking the spell. Elise excused herself, promising to return. Julian watched her move through the shop, effortlessly navigating between customers and shelves. Memories flickered like old film, a young girl with tangled hair and scraped knees, always challenging him to climb higher, run faster, dive deeper. His phone buzzed with messages demanding attention. Property assessments? Stock fluctuations. Board members seeking reassurance about this side project that had pulled him away from headquarters. None of it seemed important now. When Elise returned, she carried 2 mugs of coffee. "Black with 1 sugar, right?" Some habits never change. Julian accepted the mug, surprised. "You remember how I take my coffee?" "I remember a lot of things," she replied, eyes meeting his, "including that you swore you'd never come back to Merlo Bay." Outside, rain began to fall, pattering against the windows. The shop grew quiet as customers departed for dinner or home, leaving them alone among the books. "Why are you here, Jules?" she asked finally. Julian stared into his coffee, searching for an answer that made sense even to himself. "Business," he said simply. But even as the word left his mouth, he knew it wasn't entirely true, not anymore, forgotten promises. The afternoon rain had transformed into evening mist by the time Julian and Elise closed the bookstore. She flipped the sign to closed, then hesitated before turning to him. There's a place down by the pier that still makes decent clam chowder? Unless you have other plans? Julian glanced at his phone. 17 unread messages, 3 missed calls from his executive team. The Harbor Inn had prepared his usual suite, and a stack of property reports awaited review. No plans, he lied, slipping the phone into his pocket. Lead the way. They walked in silence along the waterfront, past weathered benches where they'd once shared ice cream cones and secrets. The boardwalk lights created halos in the mist, illuminating Elise's profile. She'd grown into her features, the determined chin, the slight upturn of her nose that he'd teased her about when they were 12. So, Blackwood Technologies, Elise said finally. Pretty impressive for someone who once crashed the school computer system trying to program a digital Valentine. Julian winced at the memory. You remember that? Mrs. Hernandez made you write an apology letter to every student in the computer lab. 32 handwritten apologies, he nodded. Worth it, though. I learned more fixing that mess than I did in a year of classes. They arrived at Pelican's Point, a weathered restaurant built on stilts over the water. Inside, nautical memorabilia covered the walls, and the wooden tables bore decades of carved initials and dates. The hostess led them to a corner booth with a view of the harbor. Still serving the best chowder in 3 counties, Elise said, sliding into her seat. Some things in Merlot Bay refuse to change. Unlike its residents, Julian replied. I never pictured you as a bookstore owner. Elise's eyes flickered with something disappointment, perhaps. And I never pictured you becoming a billionaire who builds cloud systems and dating apps. We create connection platforms, not dating apps, he corrected automatically, then caught himself. Sorry, force of habit from investor meetings. Their server arrived with water and menus, but they both ordered without looking clam chowder and sourdough bowls. A tradition from their youth. Your parents' house is gone, Elise said after the server left. They built condos there a few years back. Ocean View Terraces. Julian nodded stiffly. I know. I own them? Of course you do. Elise looked out at the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed gently against the docks. Why did you really come back, Jules? The question hung between them, heavier than it had in the bookstore. Julian studied the condensation forming on his water glass, gathering his thoughts. Merlot Bay is experiencing economic decline. The fishing industry can't sustain it anymore? I'm exploring investment opportunities that could revitalize the area. Business, then? Her voice carried a hint of disappointment. Well, at least you're honest. Their food arrived, steam rising from the bread bowls. Julian took a spoonful of the rich, creamy chowder and was instantly transported back to summer evenings after long days of swimming and exploring. Do you remember the promise tree? He asked suddenly. Elise paused, spoon halfway to her mouth. The old oak on Morrison's Hill? We carved our initials into it the summer before 8th grade? Made all those ridiculous promises. She smiled faintly. I promised to become a famous writer. And I promised to invent something that would change the world, Julian added. We were so certain of everything back then. That's the gift of childhood, absolute certainty in an uncertain world. Elise's eyes grew distant. The tree's still there, you know. They were going to cut it down when they expanded the hiking trails, but there was quite the local protest. I may have been involved. Julian felt a surge of gratitude that surprised him. Thank you for saving it. Some promises are worth protecting, she replied softly, as they ate. Elise filled him in on the town's businesses that had closed, families that had moved away, the struggles of the remaining residents. Julian found himself listening more intently than he had in any boardroom meeting. What happened to your grandmother's house? He asked. The Victorian on Sycamore Street? I live there now, Elise replied. After Gram passed, I couldn't bear to sell it. It's too big for one person, but it's home. Julian remembered summer afternoons on that wraparound porch, drinking lemonade while Elise's grandmother taught them to play gin rummy. The house had seemed magical then, full of strange treasures and hidden corners. And your painting? Julian asked. You were always sketching something? Elise's expression clouded slightly. Life happens. Some dreams get put aside. She changed the subject quickly. What about your sister? How's Charlotte doing? She's in Australia now. Marine biologist. Married with twins. That fits. She was always collecting those tide pool creatures. Their conversation drifted through memories and updates, carefully navigating around the years of silence between them. Neither mentioned the summer before Julian left, when everything changed. Neither spoke of the letters that stopped coming or the phone calls that were never returned. As they finished dinner, Julian's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it reluctantly. You should take that, Elise said, understanding in her eyes. The billionaire's work is never done. Julian silenced the phone. It can wait until morning. Outside, the mist had cleared, revealing a sky scattered with stars far, more visible here than in the light-polluted cities where Julian typically spent his evenings. I forgot how many stars you can see. Here, he murmured as they walked along the harbor. That's the problem with big cities, Elise replied. You forget to look up? They reached the intersection where they would part ways, Julian to his luxury hotel, Elise to her grandmother's Victorian. There's a town council meeting tomorrow evening, Elise said. Since you're here on business, you might find it informative. 7 o'clock at the community center. I'll try to make it, Julian replied. Though his schedule was already packed with property tours and potential investment meetings, Elise nodded, then turned to leave. After a few steps, she paused and looked back. The morning you left town, she said, her voice carrying in the quiet night. You promised you'd come back for me when you made it big. Do you remember? The words hit Julian like a physical blow. A 16-year-old boy standing at a bus stop, making promises he didn't understand to a girl whose tears he couldn't bear to watch. I remember, he said softly. Elise held his gaze for a long moment. 18 years is a long time to keep someone waiting. Jules. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Julian alone beneath the stars, haunted by promises he'd made and forgotten, and one he'd broken without even trying. Asterisk. Whispers and suspicions. The community center buzzed with tension as Julian slipped into the back row. Most seats were filled with Merlot Bay residents, fishermen in weathered caps, shopkeepers he vaguely recognized, elderly couples who'd lived here their entire lives. Elise sat near the front, her chestnut hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, notebook open on her lap. Mayor Thompson balding now, but with the same booming voice Julian remembered called the meeting to order. As you all know, our town faces significant financial challenges. The harbor needs repairs, tourism is down, and several businesses have closed in the past year alone. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. However, the mayor continued, brightening, I'm pleased to announce that Blackwood Technologies has expressed interest in developing portions of our waterfront district. All heads turned as the mayor gestured toward Julian. Mr. Blackwood has returned to his hometown with some exciting possibilities for Merlot Bay's future. Julian noticed Elise's shoulders stiffen. She turned, her expression unreadable as their eyes met across the room. The mayor continued, While nothing is finalized, we're discussing a potential tech campus, retail spaces, and upscale residential units that would bring jobs and revenue to our community. A fisherman stood, weathered face creased with concern. And what happens to the existing businesses? To people who've been here for generations? That's what we're here to discuss, the mayor replied smoothly. Mr. Blackwood, perhaps you'd like to address some of these concerns? Julian hadn't planned to speak. His development team usually handled these presentations while he remained safely behind the scenes. But now, with all eyes on him, especially Elise's, he found himself walking to the front of the room. I grew up in Merlot Bay, he began, surprising himself with the emotion in his voice. My parents ran the hardware store on Main Street for 20 years. I learned to swim in these waters, climb the rocks at North Point, Got my first job scraping barnacles off boats at the marina. The tension in the room softened slightly. I understand your concerns, Julian continued. Any development would preserve the character and history of Merlot Bay while creating sustainable economic opportunities. Nothing would proceed without community input and approval. Questions followed, pointed, passionate, occasionally hostile. Julian answered each one, increasingly aware of Elise watching him, her expression shifting between skepticism and something harder to define. When the meeting adjourned, Julian found himself surrounded by residents, some offering suggestions, others voicing concerns. By the time he extracted himself, Elise was gone. The next morning, Julian canceled his meetings and walked to Tidewater Books. A closed sign hung in the window, unusual for a Wednesday. He tried calling Elise, realizing he'd never asked for her number, then spent the afternoon reviewing development plans with his Seattle team via video conference, the plans on his screen. Modern buildings of glass and steel suddenly seemed jarringly out of place for Merlot Bay's weathered charm. Pull back on the contemporary elements, he instructed his design director. Think historic preservation with modern amenities, not corporate campus. That evening, Julian drove to Elise's grandmother's Victorian. The house looked much as he remembered: white gingerbread trim, wraparound porch, garden bursting with wildflowers. He hesitated before knocking, suddenly uncertain of his welcome. Elise answered, wearing paint-splattered overalls, surprise evident in her face. "Jules? What are you doing here?" "You weren't at the bookstore," he said simply. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. I'm just in the middle of something." Julian followed her through the familiar entryway, past photographs of her grandmother, and into what had once been the formal dining room. The space was now a studio, with canvases stacked against walls, jars of brushes on every surface, and the scent of oil paint hanging in the air. In the center, on an easel, sat a half-finished seascape, the view from North Point at sunset, rendered with remarkable skill. "You're still painting," Julian said softly. "Just for myself now," Elise replied, wiping her hands on a cloth. "I needed a mental health day after last night." "Because of the development plans?" She turned to face him directly. "Because I don't know what to believe anymore. The Jules I knew wouldn't build luxury condos where families have lived for generations." "That's not what I'm planning," Julian protested. "Then what are you planning?" "Because the town is full of rumors that Blackwood Technologies is buying up properties along Main Street. The Hendersons already sold their bakery. The marina's under contract." Julian's jaw tightened. "Those are confidential business transactions. This isn't just business, Jules. These are people's lives, their histories, their futures." Elise's voice rose with emotion. "You disappeared for 18 years, and now you're back to what save us? Transform us? Turn us into another gentrified coastal retreat for wealthy tech workers?" "That's not fair," Julian countered, his own temper flaring. "Merlot Bay is dying. You said it yourself. The fishing industry can't sustain the economy anymore. I'm trying to help. By buying people out? By replacing local businesses with chains that match your corporate aesthetic?" She gestured toward the window where the sun was setting over the bay. "What happens to all this when you're done helping?" Julian took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure. "Elise, I would never—" "You made promises before, Jules," she interrupted, voice softening with hurt. "You didn't keep those either." The accusation hung between them, heavier than any business dispute. "That was different," he said finally. "We were kids, were we?" Elise turned back to her painting, adding a stroke of deep orange to the sunset. "I wasn't the one who stopped writing. Who changed my number? Who pretended our friendship never existed?" Julian flinched. "After my parents died, I couldn't—" "I know about your parents," she cut in. "I was at the funeral. You didn't even acknowledge me." The memory surfaced, painfully standing beside two caskets, numb with grief. Seeing Elise across the cemetery but unable to face her compassion when all he wanted was escape. "I'm sorry," he said. The words inadequate for the years of silence. Elise sighed, setting down her brush. Why are you really here, Jules? After all this time? Julian looked out the window at the town he'd fled. At the bay where he'd once felt both trapped and free, at the girl now woman he'd left behind. I don't know anymore, he admitted. Truth behind masked rain battered the windows of Julian's hotel suite as he reviewed. Acquisition contracts spread across the bed. Outside, lightning illuminated the churning bay waters, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the building's foundation. A storm fitting his mood. His phone rang. Teresa, his executive assistant. The board is getting anxious, sir, she reported. They're questioning the scale of investment in a town this size. Julian rubbed his temples. Tell them I'm confident in the projections. And the PR department needs approval on the press release about the Merlo Bay Innovation Center. Hold that, Julian instructed. Nothing goes public yet. After ending the call, Julian stood at the window, watching lightning split the sky. 3 days had passed since his argument with Elise. 3 days of avoiding Tidewater books, of immersing himself in meetings and property assessments, of trying to ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. A knock at his door startled him. Opening it, he found Nora Weathers, the elderly owner of the bait shop, soaked from the rain. Mr. Blackwood, she said without preamble, we need to talk. Julian ushered her in, offering a towel and coffee. Nora had been ancient when he was a child. Now she seemed somehow both frailer and more formidable. I came to ask about your intentions, she said, fixing him with a penetrating stare. My shop's been approached 3 times by your company. I'm not selling, but I want to understand what you're planning. Julian hesitated, then made a decision. He retrieved a large portfolio from his briefcase and spread the contents across the table. This is what I'm planning, he said quietly. Nora examined the designs, her expression shifting from suspicion to surprise. This isn't what people are saying. People rarely get the whole story. For the next hour, Julian explained his vision: not luxury condos or corporate offices, but a carefully designed restoration of Merlo Bay's historic district. Traditional architecture preserved and reinforced. The marina expanded but maintaining its character. A technology education center that would bring jobs while training local youth. Artist studios and public spaces along the waterfront. It's not about replacing Merlo Bay, Julian explained. It's about saving what makes it special while giving it a future. Nora studied him over her coffee mug. Does Elise know? Julian's silence was answer enough. That girl carried a torch for you longer than she should have, Nora said bluntly. When you left, something in her dimmed. She gave up that art scholarship to stay with her grandmother. Never did go to college. The revelation hit Julian like a physical blow. What scholarship? Rhode Island School of Design. Full ride, Nora shook her head. Her grandmother fell ill that same month you left. Elise wouldn't leave her. Julian remembered the acceptance letter he'd never received. The calls he'd ignored during those dark months after his parents' accident. The distance he'd deliberately created. I didn't know, he said softly. There's a lot you don't know, Nora replied, rising to leave. But it's not too late to learn. After Nora departed, Julian made another call, not to his executive team, but to the town clerk's office. By midnight, he had what he needed. The next morning. Still raining, he drove to the community center where volunteers were preparing for the annual Founders' Day celebration. Now at risk of cancellation due to roof leaks and electrical problems, Julian found the coordinator, Mrs. Patel, his former calculus teacher, supervising half-hearted decorating efforts around buckets catching drips. Mr. Blackwood, she greeted him with surprise. What brings you here? By afternoon, contractors were repairing the roof. Electricians were upgrading the wiring, and Julian's personal check had covered not only repairs but expanded funding for the celebration. Next, he visited the elementary school, anonymously establishing a technology fund. Then the Historical Society, arranging preservation grants. The harbor master's office, discussing sustainable fishing initiatives. At each stop, he asked about Elise, her volunteer work with literacy programs, her quiet financial support of struggling neighbors, Her fight to save the town's historic buildings. Evening found him at the promise tree on Morrison's Hill, rain still falling through the massive oak's branches. The carved initials were weathered but visible. JB plus E, surrounded by childish renderings of stars. Julian traced the carving with his fingers, remembering that summer day. Their promises to each other, to themselves, to return to this spot one day when their dreams came true. Some promises were never meant to be broken. The rain suddenly intensified, then stopped as a shadow fell over him. Julian looked up to find Elise standing there, holding an umbrella over them both, her eyes questioning. "Nora told me I might find you here," she said. "I should have come back sooner," Julian replied simply. "Why didn't you?" Julian looked out over the town lights glimmering through the mist, the distant sound of waves against the shore. "After my parents died, I couldn't face anyone who knew me before. Especially you." The admission cost him, but he continued. "You knew the real me, not the orphan, not the ambitious college student, certainly not the businessman. I was afraid you'd see through everything I was trying to become." "And what were you trying to become?" "Someone who couldn't be hurt again," he answered honestly. "Someone in control." Elise sat beside him on the wet ground, shoulder touching his beneath the umbrella. "How's that working out for you?" "Despite everything," Julian laughed. "Not particularly well at the moment." He told her then about his real plans for Merlo Bay, not corporate development but community preservation with an eye towards sustainable growth. He showed her the designs on his tablet, watched her expression transform as she understood. "Why didn't you tell everyone this from the beginning?" she asked. "Business strategy," Julian admitted. "Announcing plans drives up property prices. But that's not the real reason." He paused. "I didn't want to presume I knew what was best for a place I abandoned." Elise studied him for a long moment. "You've changed, Jules." "Not as much as you might think," he replied softly. "I still can't draw anything beyond stick figures. Still take my coffee black with 1 sugar. Still miss my best friend every day." The admission hung between them, fragile as morning mist. "I saw your scholarship letter," Julian confessed. "It came after I changed my number. I was going to forward it, but then you decided to cut all ties," Elise finished for him. "It's ancient history, Jules. I made my choices. Because of your grandmother." Elise's eyes widened slightly. "Nora has been talking too much. Was it worth it?" Julian asked. "Giving up your dream?" Elise looked toward her studio, visible through the trees. "Dreams change. I found different ways to create art, different ways to be happy." She turned back to him. "Was becoming a billionaire worth it?" Julian considered the empire he'd built, the emptiness that had driven him back to Merlo Bay. "I'm still figuring that out." The road forward Founders' Day dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. Merlo Bay's main street had transformed, overnight storefronts freshly painted, sidewalks repaired, fairy lights strung between lampposts. The community center gleamed with new fixtures, the stage set for evening performances. Julian wandered through morning preparations, watching residents hang banners and arrange flower displays. No one treated him as an outsider anymore, not after word spread about his anonymous donations, his genuine development plans. His hours spent personally helping repair storm damage, he found Elise at her booth near the harbor, where she was displaying paintings for the first time in years, seascapes and town scenes capturing Merlo Bay's quiet beauty. "These are extraordinary," Julian said, studying a canvas that depicted children leaping from the pier, suspended in golden afternoon light. "Thank you," Elise replied, a blush touching her cheeks. "It feels strange, showing them publicly." "You should be in galleries." Julian meant it. Her work had matured beyond the promising sketches of her youth into something powerful and distinctive. "Actually," Elise said hesitantly, "the Portland Museum called yesterday. They're interested in featuring local artists for their coastal heritage exhibit." Julian's face brightened. "Elise, that's incredible." "I might have mentioned your name when they asked about sponsors," she admitted with a mischievous smile. "Hope that's okay. More than okay." Julian couldn't remember the last time he'd felt such uncomplicated happiness for someone else's success. Throughout the day, they moved separately through the festival, Julian meeting with business owners to discuss his revised development approach, Elise coordinating children's art activities. Yet they remained aware of each other across the crowded square, exchanging glances and smiles that felt both new and comfortingly familiar. Evening brought the traditional bonfire on the beach. As darkness fell, townsfolk gathered around the flames, sharing stories and songs that had been part of Merlot Bay's heritage for generations. Mayor Thompson approached Julian as he stood at the edge of the circle, watching Elise laugh with a group of children roasting marshmallows. "The town council reviewed your proposal this morning," the mayor said. "It was approved unanimously." Julian nodded, unexpectedly moved. "Thank you." "No, thank you," the mayor replied. "You've offered us a future without sacrificing our past. That's rare these days." As the mayor moved away, Julian felt a presence beside him. Elise handed him a perfectly toasted marshmallow. "I heard about the council's decision," she said. "Congratulations." "It means I'll be around for a while," Julian replied carefully. Overseeing the initial phases, Elise studied the flames. "How long is a while?" "That depends." "On what?" Julian turned to face her fully. "On whether there's a reason to stay beyond business." The firelight illuminated her face, the same eyes that had once challenged him to dive from the highest rock, the same determined chin that had jutted forward when she disagreed with him, the same gentle smile that had sustained him through his loneliest childhood days. "Jules," she said softly, "why did you really come back to Merlot Bay?" He could have mentioned market analyses or investment opportunities, could have cited his executive team's strategic plan for expanding into smaller communities. Instead, he told the truth he'd only recently admitted to himself. "Because for all my success, I've never felt at home anywhere else." Elise's expression softened. "And now?" "Now I'm wondering if it's too late to keep an old promise." Julian hesitated, then continued. "Not the one about coming back when I made it big, a different one about being honest, always." "With my best friend." "I'm listening," Elise said. "I've spent 8 years building a life I thought I wanted, only to realize what I really wanted was here all along." Julian took her hand, calloused from paintbrushes and gardening. "I'm not asking you to pick up where we left off. Too much has changed. But I'd like the chance to know who you've become, to show you who I am now, to see if we might find something new together." Elise was quiet for a long moment, the bonfire crackling between them and the dark sea beyond. "We're not those kids anymore," she said finally. "I'm not waiting for someone to rescue me, and you're not running from who you used to be." "That sounds like a better foundation than we had before," Julian observed. Elise smiled, squeezing his hand. "I think it might be." Above them, stars emerged more visible here than anywhere in Julian's travels. The tide was coming in, waves whispering against the shore. Around the bonfire, townspeople sang songs that had echoed on this beach for generations. "I have a confession," Elise said suddenly. "I'm considering taking a sabbatical next year, maybe spending some time in New York, seeing if my art can find an audience." "New York has excellent coffee shops," Julian replied. "And Blackwood Technologies happens to have offices there." "Is that so?" Elise's eyes sparkled in the firelight. "We could discover a new city together," Julian suggested. "Or rediscover this one." "Or both." Elise leaned against his shoulder, her warmth more comforting than any luxury his wealth had provided. "Both sounds good." As midnight approached, they walked along the shore, making plans that weren't promises not yet but possibilities. Behind them, the bonfire burned lower and ahead, the lighthouse beam swept across dark waters. Guiding ships home. Julian thought of the frightened, angry boy who had boarded a bus 18 years ago, determined never to look back. Of the driven, isolated man he'd become. Of the person he might yet be, with roots in his past and branches reaching toward an unforeseen future. Beside him, Elise stopped to examine a perfect sand dollar revealed by the receding tide. She placed it in his palm, a gift, a symbol, a beginning. "Welcome home, Jules," she whispered, and for the first time in 18 years he truly was.